Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Time to take a look at the latest Doctor Who episode that was screened earlier this evening, and of course it's been available for your delectation on the BBC iPlayer since 8 o'clock this morning. It's disturbing to think that we are now over halfway through the season. This is the 5th of 8 episodes. Over its 62-year history, I think Doctor Who has proven itself again and again as a terrific engine for telling stories, possibly one of the most formidable and impressive and flexible engines for storytelling in the history of television, because Doctor Who can tell any sort of story. It can go anywhere in time and space, and this is exactly what this episode was all about. Doctor Who as stories. Yes, welcome back. The Story and the Engine was written by Inua Ellams, who is a Nigerian-born poet and playwright. I don't know if this is his first TV script. If it was very accomplished as a script. Very well written, very mature and sophisticated, thought-provoking, full of lots of ideas. And as I mentioned in the pre-titles bit, it's all about Doctor Who, really, and its power as a story and its strength as an engine for telling stories. And I apologise for using that expression several times so far, because the story is called The Story and the Engine. And it's pretty much all about how important storytelling is and how we mustn't lose our belief in stories and our interest in stories and our need for stories, because I think that's a fundamental requirement for being human in a way, is the ability to absorb stories and interpret stories and enjoy stories, and that most basic and simplistic level of actually saying that was a story and I enjoyed it, which is possibly where I have a problem with this particular episode, because I'm not entirely sure I completely enjoyed it. I admired it as a production because it was, as ever, beautifully put together. Only the BBC could dare try to recreate a Lagos street market in a studio in Cardiff, but they did it very impressively. If I felt perhaps a little unnecessarily, bearing in mind how little time we actually spent in that market in one short sequence at the beginning of the episode, I think that having said that one of Doctor Who's greatest strengths is its ability to tell any type of story, it's not always the case that we as fans are going to appreciate what that story is, or what that story is telling us, or the setting of that story, or the component parts of the story. And I think that's the issue I had with this here, because this is a story marinated in a culture that I'm not familiar with, a culture that I don't have any affinity for particularly. So I'm distanced from it going in. Now, that doesn't mean that I should not learn about these things. I'm always happy to learn about new cultures and things happening in the world and things that shape the world and shape our stories. But this is very, very much embedded in a world that the writer Inua Ellams obviously does very well, that sort of Nigerian barbershop culture. And that is apparently a very big thing in North Africa, the idea of barbershops where men congregate to enjoy each other's company, to tell stories, to swap news and just be themselves. The story also quite pointedly addresses, in a way that Jodie Whittaker's era never really did, address the Doctor as a woman. This addresses the Doctor as a black man for the first time, and it's a very noticeable scene in the TARDIS where the Doctor says, I have this black body. Sometimes on Earth I am not welcome, but I can go somewhere where I am welcome. I'm amongst my own people. People don't point at me or make comments about the colour of my skin. I belong in this particular community. And that's fine. That's an interesting point to make, because I think it is interesting that the Doctor addresses his skin tones and how he's not looked like this before. There have been previous episodes, Dot and Bubble springs to mind particularly, where that was a major shock conclusion to the episode. I think the issue, as a long-time Doctor Who fan I have, is the Doctor's references to having been to this place before. He's been to this barbershop. He knows Omo, the person who runs it. They're old friends. And I think, obviously, in the history and the continuity of Doctor Who, fans and people like Big Finish like to fill in the gaps in Doctor Who continuity and put in untold stories and untold characters. But the idea that the Doctor is visiting an old friend in an old environment that he's familiar with and he's gone to before, it just stuck out a little bit, because it's not something that I can wrap my head around as part of the continuity of the Doctor. This Doctor has never been to this barbershop before, as far as we know. There is a suggestion from a certain character's appearance that he's been there in a previous incarnation, but that in itself creates some sort of a bit of a continuity landmine, because it contradicts events from a Jodie Whittaker era story. And I'm conscious of the fact that this is a new episode. People might not have seen it yet. I don't want to post massive spoilers, but there's a sequence that undermines a previous established point that was made about Jodie Whittaker's Doctor not wanting to know about her pre-William Hartnell past. I'll leave it there and let you work out what that is when you get to see the episode. So I think the issue is that I didn't chime with this setting particularly, and this isn't a racist point or a racial issue. It's just that this is a culture that isn't something I'm familiar with, and whilst it was presented very well, and there was a certain warmth amongst that community, although the story, of course, is that Omo has apparently trapped people inside this barbershop, which he is then using to power a giant spider which is travelling across space, and he's using the power of stories to make this thing move across space. Now that also struck me as, we've got to have a monster in this story. Let's have a big spider, because spiders always go down well in Doctor Who. I'm not entirely sure, having watched the episode once, what the connection was, what the point was with Omo powering this spider. Where did he want to go exactly? They just seem to be moving through space, but I can't recall from the dialogue that he had an end point or a destination or somewhere that he wanted to go. I think my main issue, apart from the fact that it was a setting that was something that is out of my sphere of experience, which isn't a problem. I've not been to Skaro, I've not travelled with Marco Polo, I've not crossed into E-space either, so all these things are outside my sphere of experience. But this is very much written from the experience of the writer, transplanting his experiences and things from his own life, because I believe that Inua Ellams has written a stage play called The Barbershop Chronicles that was very popular in 2017. So it's obviously something that's big in his life and big in his world. And transplanting that into Doctor Who is perfectly valid. But I feel that perhaps in terms of story and momentum and things happening, the story was a bit lacking, because most of the story was set in the barbershop. Most of the story was dialogue driven. There was not a lot of action in this. There were a couple of sort of slightly more adrenalised scenes, but there was very much talking about the Doctor's relationship with this barbershop location, the fact he's been there before, although we've never seen that, relationships with various characters, the fact that Omo is a friend who feels has let him down, all these other youngsters in the barbershop who have been trapped there because the stories that are being told in that environment is powering this creature. But I don't quite know what it all meant in terms of where it fits in and around itself, in a way. I'm not sure what the imperative of the story was, because I don't feel that there was much of one, because it was very much, I think, a vehicle for Inua Ellams to show this piece of African culture that people in the UK aren't aware of, to dramatise it and make people aware of it. And I think that's probably a fine thing to do. Obviously, the internet go woke, go broke crowd will be having screaming fits about this, because there's not a lot of white faces in this episode. That doesn't bother me. But I think with Doctor Who, it's always about, ironically, in the case of this story, the story that drives the engine of the show. And I felt that the story here was slightly lacking, I think, because it was so much of a chamber piece in a dreaded Stephen Moffat era style of people just talking to each other. Just a lot of yapping, a lot of talking, a lot of slightly muddy exposition that ultimately didn't make the story much clearer than it was. This isn't an episode I will rush to watch again, to be honest. A bit like Demons of the Punjab from Jodie Whittaker's first series. That was an interesting story that dealt with issues regarding the partition and the strife that was caused during that period, with a bit of sci-fi thrown in with these feeble aliens called the Thijarans. But I think that perhaps a more interesting story could have been made of it. As I said, it's very dry, very talky, very chamber piece. And I think Doctor Who, we're used to it being bigger than that now and broader and faster. This was very, very slow paced for a single 46, 47 minute episode. And I think ultimately it didn't engage me in the way that I like to be engaged with Doctor Who. I thought it was very well done. I liked the idea of stories. And I like the fact that the series is saying, look, stories are important. The Doctor's stories are particularly important. And that's basically what this was all about. Beyond that, there are things that, probably don't make a lot of sense. The idea that Omo was a god and then he wasn't a god. And then the thing about people's hair growing and what the spider thing was all about. That was a bit woolly. The script could have made that clear. And I think perhaps the script needed another couple of refinements to iron out some rough stuff. Because I think there's a coherent story in there somewhere. The elements are there. Ironically, I don't think that this particular engine brought that to life as well as perhaps it could have done. I have no problem with any of the performances. I mean, Shudikat was on sparkling form here. He clearly felt connected to this particular episode, particularly because of what it said about him as a modern black man in the world, particularly touching on cultural things he's aware of. He's a Nigerian man. I'm sure he's very well aware of this cultural phenomenon. Belinda, Verada, Sathu, slightly sidelined, stuck in the TARDIS. I like the scene of her in the TARDIS with these alarms and things going off, and then she rushes out to become part of the story. I think the performance is all generally very good. The production was very good. The sets, everything looked very authentic and very convincing. The only thing that didn't convince me really was the story, I have to say. It didn't engage me. And that can happen. I mean, not every Doctor Who story is going to be a winner. We can't expect every episode to knock it out of the park. But in this era of a Doctor Who that's more socially aware and has more to say, because I think that we all understand now that Russell T Davies, in this era of Doctor Who, he is much more concerned with telling stories that have something to say about the world today and humanity, rather than just, there's some monsters, run up this corridor and run back down again. He wants to use Doctor Who now as a vehicle to say things, and that's perfectly fine. I think he's at that stage of his life. I know he feels that he has to say certain things that enrage him about the world and as enrage us all, and he's in a position now to do that sort of thing. But I'm not entirely sure that this episode worked either as a straightforward Doctor Who episode or as a Doctor Who episode trying to make this point about how fiction has a massive importance in all our lives. So I didn't dislike the episode. I found it engaging to look at, but I became conscious about halfway through that it was sort of slipping away a little bit, and I just was losing a bit of interest in it. Not to the extent that I did with, say, last year's Christmas special, Joy to the World, which within 5 to 10 minutes was appalling me and every fibre of my being. But this kept me engaged enough to stick with it to the end. But it is one of those episodes that you will hold up as an absolute classic of the modern era of Doctor Who. And I suppose it's the weakest of the season so far. However, it's still well made and entertaining. I mean, you can watch it and you will get things from it, but I think I just got frustrated by the slightly non-linear nature of the story and the fact that there were certain things going on that I couldn't piece together. And Doctor Who is often a puzzle box. Doctor Who often requires you to make certain leaps to put things together. But I think here there were certain plot things that could have been better explained. But all in all, a decent 45 minutes, but not one I'll rush to rewatch. Sorry, I've got the Radio Times here, which I often have handy to remind me of cast members' names and so on. Ultimately, I think the main take from this is that after 62 years on television, give or take a 17-year gap, I think Doctor Who's earned the right to tell whatever types of stories it likes. And if it wants to tell a story like this that doesn't necessarily work for me, but may well work for you and may well work for many who are watching, it's absolutely fine. And I would fight to the death for Doctor Who's right to tell whatever types of stories it likes. And I think this is a perfect example of Doctor Who doing just that. So, Story on the Engine gets from me, I'm going to give it 6 out of 10 6 out of 10. I think that's probably quite a generous mark. It gets that mainly because of the way it was well directed and well put together, and the working parts worked well, but they didn't work well together. So that's Doctor Who, The Story and the Engine, which is available now on the iPlayer. I'd be very interested to hear what you thought of it. If you're able to fill in any of these little gaps in the story that have perhaps eluded me, then please leave a comment down below. I'd love to know what you made of the story, as that's what it's all about. That's what it's titled. As ever, please don't pop on and put a comment saying RIP Doctor Who, Doctor Who's gone woke and gone bro. I'm not interested in that sort of stuff. If you put that sort of comment on, it's just going to be deleted. Nobody's ever going to see it. So save your time in writing it and go and find other channels which will happily embrace you if you have those sorts of opinions and such poor critical faculties, because I don't want that here. Thank you for watching this video. As I said, leave a comment down below, like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you soon. But until I do, you need to keep taking the stuff.